HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Well of Souls, Uncovering the Banjo's Hidden History by Kristina Gaddy. Foreword by Rhiannon Giddens. Read by Chanté Mccormick. Foreword. Rhiannon Giddens. The banjo is a tricky instrument. It is a physical object with skin, wood, gut, metal. It is a means to make music, rhythmic, melodic, drones, arpeggios. It is an emblem of culture, of nationalism, of ephemeral yet deeply rooted heartstrings, and of made-up histories used as weapons. It's got a lot going on. Anybody who studies the banjo knows they are walking into a swamp of unknown players, scraps of primary sources, dead ends, flashes of brilliant understanding, and also of utter despair. How is something so integral to American culture so badly understood and so widely misrepresented? It has taken a small army of dedicated researchers to correct the record. To do good work in the world of the banjo is to have insatiable curiosity, exacting patience, and an awareness of where you are as the observer. All of these things, plus an excellent writing style, sense of humor, and keen brain, yes, it's demanding. And Kristina Gaddy has it all in spades. And boy, are we banjoists lucky to have her. When I first started my banjo journey, I had no idea where it would take me. I just knew I loved the sound. But as I played more and learned the history, and as I picked up older styles of banjo and began to take in the warm sound of older-styled wooden-rimmed and gourd instruments, more akin to the instruments that Kristina begins with in her book than the ones you hear in modern banjo music today, I became aware also of an extra musical feeling when I played, an urge to make little musical offerings when I picked up the instrument, an eventually unshakable belief that when I played my banjo, I was connecting with my ancestors in a way I can only describe as spiritual. But I never really talked about it too much because of the image the banjo holds in popular consciousness, even if you can get past the pickin' and grinnin', sometime goofball image of the banjo. It's touted mainly as a great dance instrument, and sometimes it gains a soulful aura when a singer-songwriter uses it to sing a plaintive air or a traditionalist croons a lonesome ballad. But nowhere is it talked about as a ceremonial instrument, a spiritual instrument, until Kristina's painstaking years-long work to document this unbelievably important aspect. Reading Kristina's book was like being told, "Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. You knew it all along." That yes, this precious artifact was more than a dance instrument for our people. Those feelings could be footnoted. It was incredible. It was unexpected. It was so needed, especially now, in these contentious times. Connections to the past that are joyous and beautiful and deep should be treasured, such as this book. Treasure the knowledge about to unfold before you. I know I do. Prelude. Centered between two small houses somewhere in swampy lowlands next to a creek, three people begin to dance. A woman in a green dress bends over slightly. She lifts her heels, stirring the sandy ground beneath her feet. Suspended between her hands, she holds a white and blue-striped cloth pinched by her index fingers and thumbs. She raises and lowers her hands, shaking the cloth in front of her. She wears an apron, a scarf around her shoulders, and a scarf around her head tied at the back. Next to her, another woman dances, a cloth outstretched between her hands. They dance on their toes. They look like they are floating. The women face a man. He's bent over too, with a dark wooden dowel in his hands. He raises and lowers the staff as he moves his feet, his blue jacket rising as he lifts his arms, his bare feet and red pants gliding across the makeshift stage. Two instruments drive the music of this dance. To the left of the dancers sits a man with a drum pressed between his knees. He holds a slender stick in each hand, beating out a rhythm. To his right, a man in a hat sits with a round body of a stringed instrument squarely in his lap. The tan-dried gourd amplifies the sounds that burst from the strings. To modern eyes, this instrument may not look like a banjo. It has no circular wooden body, no metal parts. Instead, a flat piece of wood bisects a round gourd, forming the neck and sound chamber. A piece of animal skin sits taut across a circular hole into the side of the gourd, a skin that creates the top of the instrument and the soundboard. Around this white circle, the maker has cut intersecting lines into the gourd. Strings extend from the bottom of the gourd across the soundboard, over a bridge that holds them up, and along the board-like neck to where it comes to a triangular point. Here, at the headstock, 3 cylindrical shapes stick out from the piece of wood. The strings attach to these tuning pegs. Turning the pegs allows the musician to tighten and loosen the strings to the pitch he wants. Halfway down the neck is another peg for a shorter string. The short string, flat fingerboard, skin soundboard, and tuning pegs are some of the banjo's defining characteristics. When the white slave owner, John Rose, saw this scene of enslaved black people before 1790, he felt it was interesting enough to commit to paper. He dipped his paintbrush in a rich red for one man's coat and a warm tan for the stringed instrument, the drum, and a ceramic vessel by the banjo player's feet. Rose was an amateur, but he painted details like the patterns on the cloths, the women tied around their hair, and the pegs and sound holes of the banjo. There is care in this work, in his brush strokes and with the people's movements. Looking at it, you feel almost instinctively that something significant is happening. Nearly 150 years later, in 1935, art curator Holger Cahill had the gut feeling that the watercolor was important and bought it on behalf of Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, who was collecting American folk art for an exhibit in Williamsburg, Virginia. The watercolor was unlike anything Cahill had seen, and its depiction of the uncaricatured blacks in the early United States still makes it unique. In the years since it was first displayed, the image has gained the title The Old Plantation and has been reprinted in books, on museum walls, and on CD and record covers. This rare piece of art is one of the most significant images of early African American music and dance in North America, and one of the earliest images of the banjo. It was not until the early 2000s that the decorative arts librarian Susan P. Shames discovered that Rose was the artist. She considered that the painting demonstrates one of the closest links between the cultural life and practices of African Americans and the cultural life and practices of their heritage in Western Africa, although she had no definitive evidence that the dance was of West African origin. Most scholars and historians have assumed that what Rose painted was a social dance or a secular celebration. Some have suggested that 2 of the dancers are jumping the broom, a marriage ceremony among enslaved blacks in the United States. This reading seems wrong. The painting has no broom. Moreover, the broom ceremony was not a tradition in Africa, hasn't been documented during the period of the painting, and is a folk custom likely introduced to the Americas by Europeans. Other scholars have simply accepted that the painting depicts an African dance, even though searches for an analogous dance in Africa have yielded no results. In 2017, my partner Pete Ross and I wandered through the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, which explores 800 years of Dutch history through the visual and decorative arts. After hours spent looking at old masters and other paintings from the Northern Renaissance, we heard an announcement that the museum would close in half an hour. We looked over the map, trying to decide which of the myriad rooms to visit before we had to leave. Tucked away in a corner on the first floor was a room with art from the former Dutch colonies. Pete and I play a game in art museums, a kind of treasure hunt that we had always lost. A trained artist and luthier, Pete has spent decades staring at images of early banjos, researching early banjo accounts, and making gourd banjo recreations and reproductions for our museums and musicians. Each time we visit a museum, we joke, "Today, we are going to find an image of a banjo that no one has ever noticed before." We come across works we've seen in print or online. At the New York Historical Society in Manhattan, we found ourselves in front of Negro Life at the South, a well-known 1859 oil painting of a scene in Washington, D.C., with a black man playing a banjo. The idea of finding a lost banjo image always feels both ludicrous and hopeful. On one hand, how would we discover something new in a painting that has been hanging on a museum wall and been seen by thousands of people every day? Surely we would have known of it already, or we could find it on the internet with a simple search. On the other hand, we know that the banjo's early history, its African-American history, has been willfully hidden and distorted. Only 3 early gourd-bodied African-American-made banjos still exist today, and Pete and I are the only people to have examined all 3. It wasn't until the 1970s that the white librarian Dina Epstein published a book outlining pre-Civil War sources that mentioned black banjo playing, and she admitted that even after looking through tens of thousands of pages of documents, she still hadn't mined every source. Known images of the banjo before 1820 number less than 15. This all makes it feel like we could find a treasure in our game. We chose the Room of Dutch Colonial Art because 2 of the 3 earliest banjos are from the South American nation of Suriname, formerly Dutch Guiana. We thought the art would expand the landscape of Suriname for us and might help us understand those banjos better. Entering the room, we saw a wall of dioramas, each about as wide as a dining room table. As I moved from one intricate papier-mâché scene of Suriname in the early 1800s to the next, I felt like I had been transported. Blue, white, and green buildings line a waterfront as sailors hoist the canvas that will take them away from this South American jungle. Black men in white uniforms and top hats row a green boat. Mules drag wagons past women in light-colored dresses with umbrellas over their shoulders. A cow munches on grass. Then I saw it. "There it is," I said, astonished. He's no bigger than my thumb, a black man leaning against a tree. He wears white pants, a blue shirt, and a headdress of feathers. He tucks an instrument into his right shoulder. It can't be bigger than my fingernail, but there it is, a gourd banjo. The back of the instrument rounds where it meets the player's body. The neck, though, might be shorter than that of a banjo. I read the information card. Vaticant van Paramaribo, 1820, by Gerrit Schalten. I coaxed Pete over. He looked less excited than I thought he should. His disposition is calmer than mine, but he also wasn't convinced that the instrument was interesting. The way the man holds it up on his shoulder makes it look like a fiddle. Pete has seen many indistinct images of banjos, images that he didn't think were accurate enough to learn something from. Feeling that this was probably just another inexact or caricatured version of the banjo, he moved on. I started snapping photos with my phone anyway, trying to get the largest version of the man I could. Pete wandered over to the next diorama. I don't remember his exact words, but "holy shit" is a favorite expletive. "That's it. That's the old plantation," he said. The scarves, the men and women facing each other as they dance. He'd been staring at that watercolor for decades, never satisfied with the cursory explanations that it just showed a dance. He thought John Rose had painted something unique, something significant, which had never been successfully deciphered. And here was something almost identical. It was almost as if the diorama had been created from the painting. We knew that would have been impossible. Rose had never framed the watercolor, and after his death, it stayed in the family until a woman named Mary Lyles bought it from one of Rose's descendants and sold it to Cahill. It wasn't publicly displayed into the 1930s. The fact that there was no banjo in the diorama didn't matter to Pete, nor did it matter that the scene was in South America rather than South Carolina. His gut told him that this dance was related to the one in Rose's watercolor. I looked again at the information card next to the diorama. Once again, Gerrit Schouten. I snapped a few more photos, and in the gift shop, I bought a book on Schouten and the dioramas. We didn't open it until we got home to Baltimore. But when I dived into it, the next holy shit moment occurred. The book led me to sources and information about the cultural context of the banjo that had been forgotten. When I looked at Rose's watercolor with this new information, I saw cultural practices and belief systems. It showed me the early banjo in the hands of enslaved Africans and people of African descent, and demonstrated that the banjo was part of a culture extending from Suriname to South Carolina to New York. It changed what we knew about the instrument's origins, which I feel also changes our understanding of something that is both symbolic of and important to American culture. The banjo is the quintessential American instrument and an object in our material culture that can tell us the story of the United States. The banjo did not exist before it was created by the hands of enslaved people in the New World. Banjo history is also symbolic of African American history. It has been ignored and distorted. All three early banjos are housed in European museums and were only rediscovered in the last 45 years. Many more that were collected and taken to Europe have disappeared from museums and private collections. The banjo is African, is often repeated on National Public Radio and in Smithsonian Magazine and The New Yorker. But it is not true. The banjo is a uniquely American instrument crafted by people of African descent. It is structurally different from any African instrument. The rabbit hole I went down made me realize that, like a creolized language or foodway, the banjo can help us explore the way in which African cultures transformed in the Americas and transformed the Americas. I compulsively researched early accounts of the banjo, which are scarce because those playing the instrument often didn't have the opportunity to record their own history, and white people in proximity to the instrument often didn't care to document banjos. As the scholar Sadia Hartman writes, every historian of the multitude, the dispossessed, the subaltern, and the enslaved is forced to grapple with the power and authority of the archive and the limits it sets on what can be known, whose perspective matters, and who is endowed with the gravity and authority of a historical actor. I read and reread every available source for descriptions that might be valuable and rediscovered lost sources, ones researchers, historians, and librarians had used in pursuit of other topics, but not to analyze early American music. Along the way, I became frustrated that white supremacy had distorted this history and that better sources don't exist. I used these sources to understand the context in which the banjo was played and tried to interrogate the bias of writers and observers by learning more about them and the world they lived in. I also looked at my own bias as a Swedish-American white woman trying to understand a culture that isn't my own but is integral to American culture. During my research, I saw the same cultural elements appear in images of the banjo, descriptions of the banjo, and the three existing early instruments. As archaeological evidence of the banjo's beginnings is scant, these elements became stand-in artifacts, evidence of behavior, movement, and relationships. The banjo appears in Suriname and New York and everywhere in between. What does that geographic spread say about the culture and lived experience of the people of African descent who created, played, and listened to the banjo? Is it really an American instrument, as we commonly think of it today? Our biases have limited the banjo to being a secular instrument. It is in the hands of a lone white man on a porch, a backup instrument in a bluegrass band, or a driver of melodies for a square dance or clogging routine. The stereotypes of the instrument from the last 180 years create these images in our minds. The assumption is that the banjo must have always been a secular instrument, from the Latin word seculum, meaning of the present world. This is putting a Eurocentric worldview on an instrument born of African beliefs and traditions. From my research, I realized that the banjo once served a higher purpose. The instrument was sacred, a word derived from the Hittite sekle, meaning custom or rites, something of an otherworldly realm of spirits, ancestors, and worship. The banjo was not just a musical instrument, but a spiritual device, and it fit into a cultural complex of music, dance, and spirituality. In the 1970s, when scholars of the African diaspora still had to argue that the enslaved who arrived in the Americas had not been denuded of their culture, poet and scholar Edward Kamau Brathwaite wrote, "There is no separation between religion and philosophy, religion and society, religion and art. Religion is the form, or kernel, or core of the African culture." He warned that when religion is mentioned, a full cultural complex should be considered. In this book, I hope to reveal that cultural complex and to have the banjo take us on a journey to remember the hidden, the willfully ignored, the forgotten, and the lost. First movement. Whenever there's an injunction on something as integral to the livability of this world as joy, there is an underground activity, a fugitive cooperative of feeling, a commune of love that isn't to be perceived by the dominant eye. Billy Ray Belcourt, A History of My Brief Body. 1. The Atlantic Ocean, 1687. They sit in this ship, this wooden prison, 375 men, women, boys, and girls, not knowing what awaits them. Rumors circulated that they would be eaten by the white cannibals, their bodies crushed to make oil or ground into gunpowder, or their skin would be made into sails and their blood used to color the flags of the ships offshore. Ships that came and went from this part of the Central African coast had flags of different colors, patterns of red, white, blue, and orange. The ship these people were on was named the Benjamin, and the red cross, white stripes, and blue triangles on its flag represented England and the people who had come for them, not the people who had taken them from their homes, but the white people who would take them from this shore and across an ocean. The Europeans arrived on the coast in their wooden ships with tall masts and billowing white sails, perhaps firing cannons to signal their arrival. The Dutch British, and French flew flags of different colors, but they all wanted the same thing from this place: people. On other parts of the continent, the Spanish, Portuguese, and Danish landed their ships for the same purpose. From Brazil to the Caribbean, the few hundred plantations growing sugar were expanding to thousands, and slave owners wanted tens of thousands more Africans each year to work in cultivating and processing the ever more valuable crop. The demand was almost insatiable. The people forced onto the Benjamin in the late months of 1687 would not literally be eaten by the white people waiting for them across the Atlantic, but they would be forced to sacrifice their bodies to produce the sugar that Europeans devoured in everything from salmon to spirits. On the ship, they did not know that yet. Caravans in Central Africa had taken captives from inland towns and cities as far east as Lake Nkunda and the Congo River Basin to the coast, a journey that could last months. These trade routes had formed in response to the European demand for copper and ivory found in the interior. Now, human beings, taken against their will, became part of the trade. When the caravans arrived at the coast, those bound for the Benjamin and other ships were held in a port somewhere south of the Set River and north of the Zaire River, along what the white men called the Luango coast. The next part of their forced journey would take them onto the waiting ships. A mafuk, a trader designated by the leader of the region, took a canoe or sent a messenger to the ship to discuss the transaction with the captain. The ships brought guns, gunpowder, cloth, and alcohol to barter for the people they wanted. The local merchants on the Luango coast wanted control over trade, and so Europeans were not allowed to own permanent buildings to operate from, unlike on the Gold Coast to the northwest, where trading companies built massive structures they called castles. Instead, on the periphery of the port, the captain would rent a building called a factory where he would store his goods. He and his crew never knew how long it would take to get what they wanted. They might be on the coast for 4 months or 8 months, waiting for their cargo, the people kidnapped in the interior. The captains came ashore, looking at the Africans available for purchase and gathering news of the region. From the inland caravans, the Benjamin's captain, Edward Daniel, brought men, women, and children, maybe in small groupings, a few at a time. These people were then taken to the factory's makeshift prison, where they spent the night before being transported to the ship. Although it had been months since they were taken from their homes, what the captives experienced next might have been the most terrifying. They were told to get in a canoe while the water around them roiled, bubbling and foaming white as the waves crashed against the shore. The never-ending waves don't make noise so much as mute it, creating a damper that sucks up the sound of voices, perhaps yelling and screaming. The captives could hear nothing over the roar. This part of the ocean is perilous, notorious for large swells of surf and underwater earthquakes. The canoe rose and sank with the waves until it reached the side of the ship, where 6 cannons faced outward. The Benjamin was not large. 4 men could lie head to toe and reach from one side of the ship to the other, and someone could easily throw a rock from the stern to the bow. Even anchored, the ship would have swayed and bobbed, making a voyage across the ocean seem treacherous at best, impossible at worst. The captives might have sat there for days, weeks, or months, while canoes arrived with new people, until the ship could hold no more or no more people could be bought. On this voyage, Captain Daniel was ready to leave when 375 captives, including about 60 children, were aboard his ship, below deck in the cargo holds retrofitted to transport people, the smell of sweat, excrement, and fear choking the air. The people who had been forced aboard spoke Bantu languages. But assuming they could speak with one another was like assuming that the Englishman, Captain Daniel, could understand a Dutch captain. While some Bantu languages are mutually intelligible, more like dialects, familiar sounding but not quite the same, others would have sounded as foreign as the tongues of the white captors. In the community.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?